The history of the U.S.S. Enterprise, CVN-65. She would be classified as a supercarrier. This ship was quite a modern marvel of engineering. She would be a floating airbase, a mobile, fast-moving weapon system, and a modern nuclear-powered attack carrier. Her flight deck alone would span over 4.5 acres. Planes would have the capability of both being launched and land simultaneously. She had 4 deck edge elevators to move the aircraft from the hangar decks to the flight decks. When she was created, she was a marvel. She would be in a class by herself. The Enterprise would be the largest aircraft carrier ever built. She would be 1,120 feet long and 257 feet wide. Her beam would be 132.8 feet, and her draft would be 39 feet. She would displace 93,500 tons with a full load. She carried approximately 85 aircraft, and she had a speed of over 30 knots. Her crew would be 3,200 for the ship operations and another 2,480 air wing crew members. Her armament would be 3 Mk-29 NATO Sea Sparrow launchers, 3 20mm Phalanx CLWS Mk-15s. It would also be the world's first ship to run on nuclear power. Her propulsion system would include 8 nuclear reactors. She would have a total of 4 propellers with 5 blades on each. She would have 4 elevators and 4 catapults. The actual construction of the vessel would take 4 years to complete. The ship's planning out would take a span of 5-year time periods. The crew had to have special training for this technologically advanced ship. They would train during her construction, and classes were held at industrial and Navy locations across the country. The planning out for this great ship went as far back as 1954. The plans were guided by the Atomic Energy Commission, Westinghouse Electric Corporation, and of course, Newport News Shipbuilding. In 1956, a prototype of the project started to take shape. The plans included a simulation of the ship's hull that was created in a desert area in Idaho. Also, simulations of the nuclear propulsion equipment was also planned out and simulated. This actually provided a basis or a blueprint that would aid the actual construction of the vessel. On November 15th, 1957, the contract was awarded to Newport News shipyards in Virginia. Newport News would build the ship with Westinghouse Electric for the nuclear reactor, which would power the ship. The U.S.S. Enterprise CVN-65's keel would be laid down on February 4th, 1958, at Newport News Shipyard. By 1959, both of the ship's nuclear reactors were operating at full power. As the great ship was being built, her crew would specially be trained in California, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania locations. Support for the construction of the ship as well as the nuclear reactors were located on the U.S.S. Benoit, ABP-35, which was located next to where the Enterprise would be outfitted. The U.S.S. Enterprise would be launched on September 24, 1960. A series of lights would spell out her name as she was launched on her huge flight deck. In October of 1961, her crew would board the ship and prepare to take her out to sea for trials. She would be captained by Vincent B. DuPoy. The ship needed to be accepted by the Navy before she could be commissioned. She would return from her trials on November 3, 1961. A broom was hoisted to show that the Enterprise had passed her seafaring trials and was welcomed into the United States Navy. The ship was commissioned on November 25, 1961. Formerly known as Hull 546, she would become the U.S.S. Enterprise, CVA or CVN-65. A total of 140 cakes were needed to feed everyone who attended the commissioning ceremony. The city of Newport News would declare it Enterprise Day and would sponsor an oyster roast to celebrate the occasion. On February 4th, 1958, Rear Admiral A. G. Mumma, U.S.N., would authenticate the Enterprise's nameplate. At the time, he was chief of the Bureau of Ships. The ship's enormous island would be built in the middle of the flight deck and later moved to the starboard side of the ship when completed. The first Catapult launch of a jet fighter would be on January 17, 1962. 3 F-8U-1 Crusaders and 1 A-4D-2N fighter jets would be launched. Once settled into a routine, the U.S.S. Enterprise would travel to Guantanamo Bay for her shakedown cruise. The Fleet Training Command Center in Cuba would take the Enterprise from a newly launched vessel, settling into new routines, to a high-alert vessel ready for combat military vessel. Once she would pass her operational readiness inspection, she would be ready for active duty. Not only did the Enterprise pass, but she passed with the highest score in her class. Her shakedown cruise would last for 3 months. The USS Enterprise would join the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, and in October, she would be dispatched to her first international crisis. Joining the ships in the Second Fleet, Enterprise would set up a blockade on October 24th to monitor Russian ships. The first Soviet ship was stopped on October 28th. Khrushchev was made to remove the missiles and dismantle the Soviet missile bases in Cuba. The Enterprise made her second and third deployments to the Mediterranean in 1963 and 1964. During the latter deployment, on May 13th, the world's first nuclear-powered task force was formed when the U.S.S. Long Beach and U.S.S. Bainbridge joined the USS Enterprise. On July 31st, the 3 ships were designated Task Force 1 and sent on Operation Sea Orbit, a historic 30,565-mile voyage around the world, accomplished without a single refueling or replenishment. It would be October of 1964 when the ship would return to Newport News shipbuilding yards for the first refueling and overhaul. And in November of 1965, the USS Enterprise, or the Big E, as she had come known to being referred as, was transferred to the Pacific's Seventh Fleet. There she became the first nuclear-powered ship to engage in active combat. On December 2nd, 1965, the Enterprise would launch 125 sorties on the first day alone. She would send 167 tons of bombs and firepower on the enemy lines. The Enterprise would set a record of 165 strike sorties in a single day. The USS Enterprise would make 6 combat deployments during the Vietnam conflict. During that time, she would return to Newport News shipyards for an overhaul and second refueling. In 1973, the Enterprise was refitted to support the Navy's newest jet fighter, the F-14A, known as the Tomcat. This was done at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. These plans were first used in the evacuation of Saigon during Operation Frequent Wild. The Enterprise flew 95 sorties during that operation. Later in January of 1979, the Enterprise went to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, where she received a 30-month comprehensive overhaul. Later in April of 1986, the mighty ship became the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to transit the Suez Canal. Later, on her 13th deployment in 1988, the Enterprise escorted reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. There she took part in delivering a decisive blow to the Iranian Navy during the Gulf War. Later in September of 1989, she would be assigned to participate in Operation Classic Resolve outside of Manila Bay. By March of 1990, the ship had just completed a highly successful worldwide deployment. She arrived at the Newport News shipyards for refueling, and one of the largest overhauls the Navy would ever attempt. In January of 1991, her 8 nuclear reactors would be refueled. Also, her 3,500 compartments would be overhauled. The overhaul would take nearly 3 years to complete. And on September 27th, 1994, she would head out for sea trials as she did when she was first built. Later in 1995, the Enterprise would return to the Newport News shipyards for upgrades to her combat and communication systems. Later in December of 1998, she would be involved in Operation Desert Fox, where she would return to the Mediterranean Sea. She would finish her deployment in March of 1999, and from mid-1999 to mid-2000, the Enterprise would undergo an extended overhaul to her systems. Later, the Enterprise would participate in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. This is where she would provide air wing combat missions from April to November of 2001. She would return to the Newport News shipyards on January 7, 2002 for more upgrades. On October 23, 2003, she would be deployed to the Persian Gulf. And in February of 2004, the U.S.S. Enterprise would return to the Newport News shipyards for an extended, selected, restricted availability. This would last until October of 2005. Later, she would be deployed to the Mediterranean Sea twice during 2006 and 2007. Later, the Enterprise would get an overhaul at the Newport News shipyards that would last from April of 2008 until April of 2010. And then, in January of 2011, the Enterprise would execute its 21st deployment, participating in Operation Enduring Freedom. During this deployment, the U.S.S. Enterprise became the fourth aircraft carrier in naval history to record 400,000 arrested landings. The landing was an FA-18F Super Hornet. On October 25, 2011, the U.S.S. Enterprise, CVN-65, celebrated her 50th birthday. This milestone made her the oldest active duty ship in the United States Naval Fleet. Her final deployment would come almost a year later on March 11, 2012, as she returned to the Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea. She would return home on November 4, 2012. On December 1, 2012, the Enterprise would be deactivated. And later, she would be decommissioned on February 3, 2017.